CEFIP is the Spanish Society of Physiotherapy in Pediatrics, and some of our aims are to update and make known the new concepts and foundations that support our clinical reasoning and support pediatric physiotherapists to carry out an evidence-based practice. In this line, CEFIP is part of the Spanish Brain Council. The Spanish Brain Council is a non-governmental organization that brings together scientific societies, patient associations, and industry with the fundamental objective to actively participate and promote everything related to brain research and its related pathologies. We have elaborated a national plan which is going to be presented next February and pretend to work on socially fair and efficient solutions to improve brain health. Good morning, Mijna. Mijna Hadders-Algra is Professor Emeritus of Developmental Neurology at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She has been working and researching on early detection and intervention for developmental disabilities, including cerebral palsy, from the beginning of her career. She's author of more than 300 papers in peer-reviewed international journals. She has written many chapters in handbooks in the field of neurodevelopmental pathologies and edited so many others. Her bibliography is detailed in the text description. Her research is fundamental to understand actual management of developmental pathologies and brain development. It is an honor to discuss with Professor Hadders-Algra to ask her important questions about early management of developmental disabilities and how can we improve our knowledge and transfer it to the clinical daily basis. Thank you very much, Professor, to be in this interview.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for the invitation and also for the kind introduction. It's just my pleasure.
The last 20 years, knowledge about how the brain develops and changes with a lesion has increased, I would say, exponentially. What do you think are the main highlights?
The main highlights for me in the area of developmental neurology are, I would say, threefold. First, I go to the developing brain, where we discovered that spontaneous activity is really a hallmark of the brain. So spontaneous activity rather than reactivity. And the second thing we learned about the developing brain is that we, during early development, have transient structures, which means that a young brain, fetal life and especially infancy, is really different from the adult brain, and that has consequences for early detection. Some disorders can simply not be detected very early because the brain hides it. And I'm thinking, for instance, of autism spectrum disorders. You first can detect them to some extent from 12 months corrected age onwards. And then the second area where we learn things is the area of early detection. And there we nowadays really use the concept that spontaneous activity, and especially in terms of movement variation, can help us in early detection of neurodevelopmental disorders such as cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. And then the third area is early intervention. And there we learned, I think, that the early intervention needs to be family-centered and not child-centered.
Thank you. Today we have screening tools to early detect risk of cerebral palsy and other pathologies. What are the main interesting points of using, as you say, general movement assessment and SINDA, for instance, in the routine practice?
Thank you very much. I already just mention that we learned that spontaneous activity, and especially spontaneous movements in terms of variation, really help us in early detection of neurodisability. And this principle of variation that is typical versus stereotypy, which is atypical, are used in general movement assessment and in SINDA's neurological scale. General movements are movements that we have from early fetal life to about 4 or 5 months corrected age onwards. And the quality of general movements, one could say, is determined by two factors. In the first place, throughout the entire general movement period, by movement complexity and variation, which actually means that you try out all the movement combinations available in your body, so variation. And the other factor that plays a role is in the last phase of general movements, that is between 2 and 5 months corrected age. At that age, infants typically show so-called fidgety movements, these tiny, elegant dancing movements occurring all over the body. And so at fidgety age, as we call it, we assess the presence of movement variation and the presence of fidgety movements. So general movements can be evaluated and used in early infancy, but the movements, the general movements, disappear when the children start to produce goal-directed movements such as reaching and neurodevelopmental assessment. SINDA has 3 scales: a neurological, a developmental, and a socio-emotional scale. And in the neurological scale, we use the principles of the quality of spontaneous movements. SINDA has been developed for infants between 6 weeks and 12 months corrected age. It's a method that, in contrast to the general movement assessment, does not need a video recording. So in that sense, SINDA is easier. SINDA's neurological scale has 28 items, and they are scored dichotomously, and the criteria are the same for the entire SINDA age range. And 7 of the 28 items, so a quarter, deals with the quality of spontaneous movements in terms of variation, typical, or stereotypy, that's atypical. And general movement assessment and SINDA both predict neurodisability equally well and very good.
They are very important tools. What do you think, in this sense, what do you think follow-up protocols have to include when a child has a risk and we have to follow up him or her? What do you think that these protocols have to include?
I really would recommend to use SINDA. As I just told you, SINDA's neurological scale very well predicts neurodisability, CP, and intellectual disability. And the neurological scale takes less than 10 minutes to complete, including administration. And like I mentioned, you don't need a video, so you immediately have the results and can discuss that with the caregivers. So that's very practical. Moreover, the SINDA is easier to learn than the general movement assessment. So if you have limited amount of time and financial resources, I would suggest that you take the SINDA and perhaps include it in your follow-up program at the corrected ages of 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. If you have more time and money, I would suggest you also include the general movement assessment, and especially in the last age period of general movement, so at fidgety age between 2 and 5 months. So the ideal age there is 3 months corrected age. If you still have more money, I would include another general movement assessment around term age.
We are always very worried about the achievement of motor milestones. However, these motor milestones depend on cognitive and perceptual factors. What is the neuroscientific theory underlying novel ways of thinking about child development?
There are actually many theories about child development, and that illustrates how little we actually know between what's happening in the developing brain and what we observe during child development. But what we do know, that there are two basic principles. The first one is that development is based on the continuous interaction between genetic information and environmental influences. And the second thing is we know, like I mentioned before, that spontaneous activity of the brain is really important. And the theory that incorporates these two elements, so the continuous interaction between genes and environment and the spontaneous activity, is the so-called neuronal group selection theory, abbreviated NGST. This theory has been developed by the neurobiologist Gerald Edelman, and he studied development by means of animal experiments, computer networks, cell cultures. So he did not study motor development and other development in children. So what we did do in Groningen is that we translated it to a framework for typical and atypical motor development. And in short, the theory runs as follows. So according to NGST, we can distinguish two phases in development. And Edelman called them the phases of primary and secondary variability. It starts with the first phase, primary variability, and it starts with the spontaneous activity in the brain, exploring all possibilities. And this exploratory activity is soon translated into movements with a large variation. All movement possibilities are tried out. And of course, this movement activity soon gives feedback, sensory feedback to the brain, and that information is used for further structural development of the brain. So, for instance, to decide which cells and which connections may remain and which has to be removed. In this first phase, the brain is not able to use this sensory information to adapt the movements to the environment. So in the first phase, we have variation, but we can't adapt. And that is what changes in the secondary phase, which typically emerges during infancy. Then the brain is able to use this sensory information, that means proprioceptive, haptic, visual, auditory information, to decide, this movement was not well adapted to the task, and this one was. And adaptation means, in particular, that movements are efficient. And so, important elements here in the secondary phase are spontaneous activity, that is, self-produced movements of the child, with trial and error, and the associated sensory information. And then, what is the result of an early lesion of the brain according to NGST? There, the results are, in the first place, a reduction of the repertoire. So that means that the children with an early lesion of the brain show less variation in their movements, so more stereotype movements. And it means when they come in the secondary phase that certain strategies that are typically available are no longer there. And the brain still is eager to find its own best solution. And that novel alternative solution is then different. And we diagnostically always say that is abnormal or that's atypical. And I would say diagnostically, that's fine with me. So we discovered that there's an impairment in the brain. But when you guide a child and family, it's perhaps better not to label this behavior as atypical or abnormal because it's the best that the brain has available. So NGST suggests that we should be tolerant to alternative solutions and strategies. Of course, this holds only true when the alternative solutions are functional and they do not result in clear deformities and contractures. If that's the case, we need to do something about it, and we typically need assistive devices. The second problem of children with an early lesion of the brain is that they have problems in this adaptability, finding their most efficient solution. They will find it, but it takes them more trial and error activity. And there are 3 reasons that that is the case. Some of the children, in particular the children with a severe brain lesion, they have typically also a reduced exploratory drive. And it's this drive that drives the discovery of the own best solution. It means that these children depend for their discovery of the best solution more on the environment, an environment playing with them and inviting them to discover and explore. The second reason that children with an early lesion of the brain have more problems in finding their own best solution strategy is that what I just told you, sometimes the optimal typical solution is no longer available. So they have to find this alternative solution, and finding an alternative solution usually takes more time. And then the third reason why they have impairments in finding the best strategy is that children with an early lesion of the brain virtually always have impairments in the processing of sensory information. So it is when they try out, trial and error, they have difficulties in understanding their own sensory feedback. And so especially the finding of the alternative strategy and the problems in the processing of sensory information make the children with an early lesion of the brain need about 10 times as much trial and error activity, self-produced movements, to discover their own best strategy. And nowadays we know how many movements children make per day. For instance, a child that just has developed the ability to walk independently makes about 14,000 steps per day. And these children with an early lesion of the brain need to make 10 times as much. So that's 140,000 steps per day. And you immediately realize impossible. Yeah. And so that is one of the reasons, I think the major reason, that children with an early lesion of the brain show a developmental delay. And you also immediately realize that half an hour physiotherapy per week does not help too much then. So that's one of the reasons that we nowadays think that early intervention should occur at home so that caregivers learn how they, in their own way, during daily caregiving activities, best can stimulate their child's development.
In this sense, what do you think are the main aspects we have to check when assessing posture and movement during development?
I think I mentioned it already a bit. We really nowadays think that assessing the variation in postures and movements is really a very important aspect of the assessment. However, you mentioned earlier on already the milestones. Also, milestones can help us. They are relatively easy to assess. One of the problems of milestones is that children typically vary a lot in the ages in which they achieve their milestone. And that means when a child is late in only one milestone, this does not tell you too much. But if a child has a delay in many milestones, that also really helps us in the detection of neurodevelopmental disorders. And then there are two other aspects of movement quality that also help us, and that are movement symmetry, and that's a traditional domain, I would say, and the novel domain is adaptability. And actually, we, during the last 10 years about, we developed also a method that evaluates all those aspects of motor development. We developed the so-called infant motor profile, the IMP, and that is an instrument video-based for the ages 3 to 18 months corrected age, or rather to the age that a child is able to walk independently for a couple of months. And in the infant motor profile, we evaluate motor development, especially in terms of quality of movements. There are 4 qualitative domains: movement variation, the adaptability, movement symmetry, movement fluency, and then the 5th domain is called performance, and means that we precisely measure developmental milestones. The infant motor profile also very well predicts CP and intellectual disability, but the infant motor profile takes a little bit more time than general movement assessment and the SINDA. So if you only would like to use an instrument for prediction, I would not recommend the infant motor profile. Infant motor profile is that it very well helps you in designing your early intervention, and it also is a very good instrument to monitor and to evaluate the effects of early intervention. The infant motor profile has been shown to be a very responsive instrument. And currently, there is a Spanish translation of the IMP manual available.
We will put the Spanish translation link into the text description. In relation to the neuroscientific theory that you already mentioned, what are the next steps in research to deep into the neurophysiological mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. There are many things that we would like to know. But, and perhaps you know, I've been studying quite a lot postural control, and that's a difficult area, but I think we would benefit from more knowledge there. The basic principles of the NGST also hold true for the development of postural control, typical development and atypical development. And we know that typical postural development starts with a so-called repertoire of direction-specific postural adjustments. What does that mean? Direction-specific means that when you fall forward, your brain immediately knows that you have to recruit the muscles on the dorsal side of your body. And when you fall backwards, you recruit them on your ventral side. And as you have multiple muscles on one side of the body, the brain really can vary. The brain can vary in which muscles are recruited, how much they are recruited, when they are recruited, whether you would like to recruit an antagonist or not. So there are many ways in which the brain can adapt the postural adjustments. And we also know that children with an early lesion of the brain have a limited repertoire of these direction-specific adjustments. And we also do know preterm infants, whether they have a lesion of the brain or not. So most preterm infants have some difficulties in learning the adaptability in postural control. And so what I think we perhaps would like to know is which type of brain lesions results in an absence of the direction-specific activity. And I think when the direction specificity is absent, then you have a severe problem in your postural control, but we actually do not know which children have this very severe problem. And those are the children that really are dependent on the postural supporting devices. What I also would like to know is that in children with an early lesion of the brain and a limited repertoire of their adjustments, how can we promote their development? And when do we need assistive devices? And when we think we need assistive devices, which ones are the best? And how do we integrate the use of postural devices, assistive devices, and promote the development of postural control? But because if you support the posture itself does not develop so much anymore because the brain needs to do things by itself. So where is the balance between support and challenge?
When talking about early intervention, there are interventions that are in green, the ones that provide practice, opportunity to explore, or to experience trial and error activities. But implementation needs to be done in a specific way. Family has to be in the center. How is that possible? How can we improve our interventions?
Thank you very much, Veronica. Yeah, you mentioned it already. Family-centered services and intervention is very important. So the one thing we really have consensus about is that the early intervention should not be child-centered or expert-centered. So family-centered. Why? Because it's the family who has to cope with the child with special needs. And it's also the family who knows best what's important in their own life. As health professionals, we do not know that. And of course, we also should refrain from interventions if we do not have the evidence that they are really beneficial for child and family. And I'm thinking in particular of treatment according to Voita or reflex-oriented approaches. We see that still quite some people use these approaches. How many they use them, we do not know, because usually the people using these approaches do not report in the literature where they put all kind of non-evidence stories in the media. So I think we should focus on interventions that use the elements that are known to be associated with better outcomes of child and family. And the important components are coaching of the family. And coaching of the family really requires a different approach of the health professional than the traditional teaching and instruction. And this change in attitude is perhaps one of the major hurdles in the new intervention strategies, because coaching really requires a different attitude. And what we also need to realize that it's important to not use your hands, not the hands of the professional or the hands of the caregiver. So we really advocate a hands-off approach to let the child explore and discover by trial and error the own best solutions. And that requires from adults that we are patient and that we really allow the child the time and the opportunity to discover.
How do you think that family-centered model can more optimally address all needs and preferences of children with neurodevelopmental disorders?
Yes, I mentioned it already. I think we really need the family-centered intervention. Like I said, it's the family who needs to cope with the situation of having a special needs, which usually is a situation that is there for many, many years. And it's only the family who knows what is important in their own life. What are their preferences? What are their rituals? What is their culture? So as a professional, we know lots about child development, the effect of preterm birth, the effect of an early lesion of the brain. And so we can help the families by providing this information, coming with hints and suggestions what they could do, but it's the family who's in charge.
When you're talking about coaching families, there is an intervention called COPCA that you have developed with your colleagues. Can you explain what are the fundamentals of COPCA?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I spontaneously already mentioned some elements of COPCA. COPCA stands for Coping with and Caring for Infants with Special Needs, and it's really a family-centered program. COPCA has two components, and the first one is the family. Like I said, we really think that the family should be central, as it's the family who needs to cope with the child with special needs. And because the family is in charge, as health professional, we use the strategy of coaching. And really, coaching is something different from teaching, from instruction. Coaching means that you are on an equal level with the family members. And so it's not the situation where the health professionals here and the caregiver there. And this means that in order to coach, you really need a different attitude. So the coach listens, the coach observes, the coach discusses with caregivers, comes with hints and suggestions, but the coach does not say you should do things like that. No. So that's the family component. And then the other component is child development. And not very surprising, the child development component is based on the NGST, so which means that keywords are the child's self-produced movements, give ample time, possibilities for trial and error, challenge the child in various situations so that the child can discover his or her own best strategies.
And what is the state of the scientific evidence of COPCA intervention?
Now, so perhaps first a few words on the effect of early intervention in general. In the effect of early intervention, we need to distinguish two groups. The first group, it's the largest group, are the children whom I would label having a moderate to high increased risk of developmental disorders. And I'm thinking in particular of preterm infants without a serious lesion of the brain. And here we know quite a lot about the effects of early intervention. And we do know that support of parents, and especially of parent-infant interaction, is associated with a visual effect on the family and the child. And we are in these groups that what works well to stimulate the infant's motor and cognitive development are these so-called developmental programs. And that are programs in which families learn how they, in their own home environment, can stimulate the child's development. We also know that in these groups, Voita and NDT-Bobot do not have a beneficial effect. So we should not use these methods in these children. Then we come to the second group, and that are the children with a very high risk of neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'm thinking of the children who have a serious lesion of the brain. There we know less about the effects, but what we do know is the following. There, COPCA is the only program that has where we have evidence that it has a positive effect on the family. So COPCA has been associated with a better family empowerment and better family well-being. But COPCA is also associated with a good effect on child development. And there, the elements that help are goal setting, in particular short-term goal setting, the self-produced movements, ample exploration with variation and trial and error. And of course, these motor components are also used in other programs like the Australian Game and the Swedish Small Step program. But like I said, in COPCA, we integrate it into the family component, and that makes that families also get a better quality of life. And one of the interesting things that we found in our studies is that COPCA is associated with a positive effect during the intervention, but interestingly, the positive effect on child development continues also after the moment that the intervention has stopped. And we think that that is because the families have learned during the period of intervention how they, in their own way, can stimulate the child's development. So families really become empowered to deal with the situation of the child with special needs so that they can cope themselves with the situation.
Thank you. There is less research about severe disorders or the severe cerebral palsy or also rare diseases. How can we handle these cases that have less evidence or no evidence about how is early detection or intervention?
That's a very good question, and it's very true. The most severely affected children are the most difficult to study. Also, because the families in general already have a very full agenda. But we really would like to have more research it. The children and the families deserve it. For the time being, I suggest that we can apply the principles that I mentioned previously. In the children with severe limitation, the family approach is essential, I think. Like I said, it's the family who needs to cope with this situation, who needs to come to terms with the alternative development of their child. And with the fact that progression in development goes with mini steps. And so there, the health professional, I think, has a very important coaching role. So I think it's important to start the discussion on assistive devices when the child is still very young. And I know that there's always a high threshold to use assistive devices, but using myself assistive devices, I really am a fan. And so I think assistive devices are there to assist you, to help you. So we should not hesitate. And for instance, power mobility, you can start with from about 9 to 10 months corrected age onwards. And being able to move around really allows the child to discover the world. So it's good for cognitive, social, and language development.
Do you think that early detection and intervention strategies, the ones that you have already mentioned, can have a socioeconomic impact?
That is always a difficult question. Theoretically spoken, I would say yes. Early detection and early intervention allow in the first place that when you really use family-centered approaches, that the family learns already from early child age onwards how to deal with the situation of having a child with special needs. So, like I mentioned, the family becomes empowered to solve their own problems, and so they will need less professional assistance. And in addition, when the child is young, we may also exploit the young brain's neuroplasticity. And so whether that is true needs to be studied.
What do you think are the big challenges for the future of care professionals and health researchers?
Yeah, the major challenges that I see are already the thing that I mentioned, the change in health professionals' attitude from the more top-down approach from the expert to the family to the equal partnership on the basis of coaching by the professional of the caregivers. And the other challenge I see is that in a world with reducing financial resources, that we need to try to solve the problems without expensive diagnostics and devices. We really need to make choices.
How do you think that brain health has to be tackled at country and European levels?
Brain health is part and parcel of general health, I would say. And for people at all ages, it's important to be physically and mentally active, to vary, and to try out with trial and error that never stops.
That's true. What policy actions have improved children's care in your country, the Netherlands? And the same question for Europe.
Okay, not an easy question. What is excellent in our country is that early intervention in general takes place at the family's home. And that is very helpful in providing adequate family-centered services. On the other hand, our country has been struggling for many years and is still struggling with inclusion and participation of children with neurodisabilities. In other words, children have the right to be included in mainstream education, but in practice, in the Netherlands, this does not work very well, as mainstream schools do not receive adequate support to allow the inclusion of children with neurodisability. And it means that most children with neurodisability go to schools for special education, where they usually are brought by special transport. And that means that we have two worlds, the children with special needs and the typically developing children, and the two worlds do not meet, and they do not learn about the other's talents and limitations. So that's not really fortunate. On the other hand, we have in the Netherlands guidelines for health professionals for children with CP and children with DCD. But of course, having guidelines for health professionals, that's something quite different from policies on care and services. The policies on care and services for children with special needs are anyway very heterogeneous across Europe. And here I really see a task for the European Brain Council and for the European Academy of Childhood Onset Disability.
So thank you very much, Professor Hadders-Algra, to discuss with me about these so important topics.
Thank you very much, Veronica. It was really my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.